To understand what the dinosaurs would have done with their continued existence, we first need to understand exactly what kind of world they were living in. Not the world of popular imagination, the grey, swampy, fog-drenched prehistoric landscape of old museum dioramas, but the real world of the late Cretaceous, as the fossil record and geological science have revealed it. Because the truth is considerably more interesting than the myth. 66 million years ago, Earth was a warmer planet, significantly warmer. Global average temperatures were roughly 4 to 10 degrees Celsius higher than today, and the polar regions, rather than being locked under permanent ice, were temperate, forested environments. There were no ice caps. Sea levels were higher by perhaps 200 meters, flooding vast areas of the modern continents beneath shallow inland seas. North America was divided in two by the Western Interior Seaway, a body of water stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, roughly 1,000 kilometers wide at its broadest point. Europe was an archipelago of large tropical islands. India was an island continent drifting northward through the Tethys Ocean. The Atlantic was narrower, the Pacific wider, and the familiar outlines of the modern world map were present only in rough, distorted sketch. The atmosphere contained more carbon dioxide than today, perhaps 2 to 4 times more, driving a powerful greenhouse effect that maintained the planet's warmth even at high latitudes. The result was a world of extraordinary biological productivity. Lush forests stretched from the tropics to within a few degrees of the poles. Flowering plants, which had first appeared roughly 130 million years ago, had by the late Cretaceous diversified into something approaching their modern dominance. Magnolias and fig trees and early relatives of the palms spread across the lowland tropics. Ferns carpeted the forest understory. Conifers and cycads still dominated in the higher latitudes, remnants of the older Mesozoic flora holding on in the cooler zones, where the angiosperms had not yet fully displaced them. This was a world built for large animals, and large animals had obliged. The diversity of dinosaurs in the late Cretaceous is something that the fossil record only partially captures, because fossilization is a rare and imperfect process. For every species whose bones ended up preserved in the right kind of sediment, in the right kind of conditions, and then happened to be discovered by a paleontologist millions of years later, dozens or hundreds of other species lived and died and left no trace at all. What we have is a sample, a remarkable, detailed, continuously improving sample, but a sample nonetheless. And even from that sample, the picture is extraordinary. In Western North America alone, the region best studied because of its exceptional fossil record, the late Cretaceous fauna included at least 40 distinct species of dinosaur living at roughly the same time. Triceratops and its ceratopsian relatives, multiple species of hadrosaurs, including Edmontosaurus and Parasaurolophus, the heavily armored ankylosaurs, the dome-headed pachycephalosaurs, the ostrich-like ornithomimosaurs, smaller theropods like Troodon and the dromaeosaurids, and presiding over all of them, Tyrannosaurus rex. Tyrannosaurus rex is worth pausing on because the science of the past 30 years has dramatically revised our understanding of this animal. The lumbering, tail-dragging monster of 20th century imagination bears little resemblance to what the fossil evidence actually shows. T-Rex was a sophisticated, highly derived predator that had been refined by millions of years of evolution. Its skull was a masterpiece of biological engineering. The bones thick and robust enough to absorb the enormous stresses of biting, but lightened by large fenestrae, openings that reduced weight without compromising strength. Its bite force, estimated from jaw muscle attachment scars and bone geometry, was the most powerful of any known land predator in Earth's history. A single bite from an adult Tyrannosaurus could crush bone, and we know it actually did this because coprolites, fossilized dung, attributed to large tyrannosaurs, contain fragments of crushed bone that passed through the digestive system, largely intact. Its brain, reconstructed from endocasts, casts of the internal skull cavity, was proportionally large for a dinosaur, with particularly well-developed olfactory bulbs. Current estimates suggest that Tyrannosaurus had a sense of smell comparable to that of a modern turkey vulture, an animal capable of detecting a carcass from kilometers away. Its vision was binocular, with overlapping visual fields giving it depth perception exceeding that of most modern raptors. Recent analysis of its inner ear suggests it was particularly sensitive to low-frequency sounds, the deep rumbles that travel long distances through both air and ground. This was not a simple animal. It was a complex, sensory-rich, behaviorally sophisticated predator that had been shaped by tens of millions of years of arms race with its prey. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs that were Tyrannosaurus's primary prey in the Hell Creek ecosystem, were equally impressive in their own way. They had evolved one of the most sophisticated dental systems in the history of vertebrate life. A hadrosaur's jaws contained what paleontologists call a dental battery, a structure in which hundreds of teeth were stacked in columns, with new teeth constantly erupting from below to replace worn ones above. At any given moment, an hadrosaur might have had 1,400 individual teeth in its jaws, compressed into a continuous, grinding surface capable of processing even the toughest plant material. This was an adaptation driven by the nature of the available vegetation. The late Cretaceous had seen a dramatic shift in plant communities. Flowering plants, many of them tough, fibrous, and chemically defended, were replacing the softer cycads and ferns that had dominated earlier Mesozoic ecosystems. The hadrosaur's dental batteries were an evolutionary response to this dietary challenge, a solution so effective that it allowed them to exploit food sources that other herbivores simply could not process. And hadrosaurs were social animals. We know this from the fossil record in a particularly direct way. At sites across Montana, Wyoming, and Alberta, paleontologists have excavated bone beds, accumulations of bones from dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of individuals of the same species, all preserved together. These bone beds tell us that hadrosaurs died together, which means they lived together. They moved in herds, potentially large ones, migrating seasonally in response to the availability of food and water, much as caribou and wildebeest do today. Some hadrosaur species carried elaborate hollow crests on their skulls. Parasaurolophus had a crest nearly 2 meters long, swept back from the skull like a curved tube. CT scanning of Parasaurolophus crests has revealed their internal structure, a complex of hollow passages connecting the nasal cavity to the crest and back down to the throat. These passages functioned as resonating chambers, amplifying and modifying the sounds produced by the animal's vocal cords. Biomechanical modeling suggests that Parasaurolophus could produce deep, resonant calls in the 30 to 48 Hz range. Sounds at the lower edge of human hearing, capable of traveling long distances through dense vegetation. These were not simple animals making simple sounds. They were socially communicating animals, using elaborate anatomical structures to produce structured vocalizations in a complex social environment. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, present yet another dimension of late Cretaceous dinosaurian diversity. The ceratopsian family tree by the end of the Cretaceous was extensive, spanning dozens of species in North America and Asia, ranging in size from the sheep-sized Protoceratops to the nearly 9-meter, 6-ton Triceratops. The horns and frills of the ceratopsians are one of the most studied topics in dinosaur paleontology, because they raise a question that goes to the heart of how evolution works. Why do they vary so much? If the horns were purely defensive weapons, you would expect them to converge on the most effective anti-predator configuration. Instead, they are wildly variable. Different numbers of horns, different lengths, different angles, different frill shapes and sizes, and edge structures. This pattern is exactly what you see in animals, where sexual selection is operating, where the structures are used for species recognition and mate choice, as well as, or instead of, combat or defense. Modern deer show the same pattern of extravagant variation in antler shape. Modern bovids show it in horn morphology. The ceratopsians appear to have been doing the same thing, suggesting a complex social and reproductive biology far removed from the simple charging rhino stereotype. Triceratops specifically shows evidence of social interaction in its horns. Many Triceratops fossils carry healed wounds on their frills and around their horns, marks consistent with combat with other Triceratops. These animals fought each other. They competed. They had social hierarchies maintained through physical contest, which implies social structures of considerable complexity. In the skies above this world, the pterosaurs still flew. By the late Cretaceous, the pterosaurs had been airborne for over 150 million years. They had first evolved flight in the Triassic before the birds and had dominated the Mesozoic skies for their entire history. And by the late Cretaceous, their diversity had declined somewhat from earlier peaks, but the largest of them reached sizes that have never been equaled by any flying animal before or since. Quetzalcoatlus northropi, from the Texas region of the late Cretaceous, had a wingspan estimated at 10 to 11 meters, roughly equivalent to a small private aircraft. Its mass has been estimated at anywhere from 200 to 500 kilograms, and the question of how it flew at all has generated considerable scientific debate. The current best hypothesis is that it was primarily a soaring animal, using thermal updrafts to stay aloft with minimal energy expenditure, in the manner of modern albatrosses and condors, but scaled to a degree that no modern bird approaches. Quetzalcoatlus was almost certainly not primarily an aerial predator. Its long and stiff neck and relatively small wingspan to body mass ratio make sustained aerial pursuit of prey unlikely. The leading hypothesis at present is that it was a terrestrial stalker, walking on all four limbs when on the ground, using its enormous beak to probe for prey, much as a modern stork does. When it launched into flight, it likely used a pole vault motion, pushing off powerfully with all four limbs simultaneously, converting the stored elastic energy of its body into the lift needed to become airborne. An animal of this size taking flight would have been one of the most dramatic spectacles in the late Cretaceous world. Alongside the pterosaurs, the birds were already present and already diverse. By the late Cretaceous, roughly 80 million years after the first birds appeared in the Jurassic, the avian lineage had produced a significant range of ecological types. Diving birds, wading birds, fish catchers, seed eaters. They had not yet achieved the dominance they would gain after the extinction, but they were ecologically significant members of the late Cretaceous fauna, occupying niches in the aerial and semi-aquatic environments that the pterosaurs did not fully cover. Beneath the surface of the western interior seaway and the world's other warm, shallow seas, a different but equally dramatic community of animals thrived. The mosasaurs were the undisputed apex predators of the Cretaceous oceans. These were not fish. They were fully marine lizards, descended from terrestrial ancestors who had transitioned to aquatic life sometime in the early Cretaceous and diversified into the ecological roles that the ichthyosaurs, an earlier group of marine reptiles, had largely vacated. By the late Cretaceous, mosasaurs ranged in length from a couple of meters to the enormous Mosasaurus itself, estimated at 14 meters and perhaps 15 tons. They were pursuit predators with deeply forked tongues, which we know from well-preserved specimens, suggesting chemosensory capabilities similar to those of modern monitor lizards. Their tails were fin-like, propelling them through the water in an eel-like sinusoidal motion. Their jaws contained 2 rows of teeth in some species, an inner row on the palate in addition to the outer row on the jaw margins, giving them an almost redundant array of prey-catching equipment. The plesiosaurs shared the Cretaceous oceans with the mosasaurs, though they occupied somewhat different ecological roles. The long-necked plesiosaurs, Elasmosaurus is the classic example, with a neck containing 72 vertebrae, were likely fish catchers, using their flexible necks to strike quickly at schools of fish. The pliosaurs, shorter-necked, larger-headed, were macropredators, taking larger prey, including other marine reptiles. And threading through all of this animal life, in the waters and on the land, were the invertebrates. Ammonites, coiled cephalopods with chambered shells, filled the Cretaceous seas in enormous diversity, hundreds of species ranging from coin-sized to dinner plate-sized, some with straight shells, some with loosely coiled shells, some with elaborately sculptured surfaces. They had survived every previous mass extinction in the half-billion-year history of complex animal life. They were, by the late Cretaceous, among the most abundant and most diverse of all marine animals. On land, the insects had already achieved something close to their modern diversity. Ants had appeared. termites had appeared. Social bees were beginning to evolve. The coevolution of flowering plants and insect pollinators, one of the most consequential ecological partnerships in the history of life, was already well underway, driving the diversification of both groups in a self-reinforcing cycle of evolutionary innovation. And in the shadows of all this productivity and diversity, the mammals persisted. It is worth being precise about what the late Cretaceous mammals actually were, because popular accounts often undersell them. They were not primitive. They were not failed experiments. They were extraordinarily sophisticated small animals, the product of over 165 million years of continuous mammalian evolution, going back to the Triassic origins of the mammalian lineage. Their teeth were among the most complex tooth structures in vertebrate evolution, tribosphenic molars, with a precise three-dimensional geometry that allowed a shearing, crushing action capable of processing a wide variety of food types. This dental versatility was one of the mammalian lineage's great evolutionary assets, allowing generalist feeding strategies that could exploit whatever food was locally available. Their brains were large relative to body size compared to the dinosaurs sharing their world. The mammalian neocortex, the layered outer region of the cerebral hemispheres that in its most developed form underlies human intelligence, was already present in the Cretaceous mammals, though in a rudimentary form. It was processing rich sensory information, particularly from smell and hearing, in animals that were navigating complex three-dimensional environments in low-light conditions. The selective pressure for cognitive sophistication was already operating on the mammalian brain. Their reproductive strategies, in the lineages that would give rise to modern placental mammals, involved extended internal gestation and intensive postnatal care, strategies that favor the production of fewer, higher quality offspring over many with minimal parental investment. This approach to reproduction would prove, in the world that followed the extinction, to be one of the great advantages of the mammalian body plan. But in the late Cretaceous, none of these advantages were being expressed at anything like their full potential. The largest known late Cretaceous mammal, Repenomamus robustus from China, reached the size of a modern Virginia opossum, perhaps 40 centimeters in length and a kilogram or two in weight. That was exceptional. Most were far smaller. Most lived in burrows or tree hollows, came out primarily at night, and spent their waking hours navigating a world in which virtually every ecological role above a certain body size was occupied by animals that had been refining their occupation of those roles for longer than the mammalian lineage had existed. The mammals were capable of more. The fossil record of the Cenozoic, the 66 million years after the extinction, proves this beyond any reasonable doubt. But in the late Cretaceous, that capability was compressed, constrained, held in potential by the simple, implacable fact of dinosaurian ecological dominance. This, then, is the world as it existed in the final years of the Cretaceous. Not a world in decline. Not a world waiting to be replaced. A world at the height of its particular kind of complexity. 165 million years of dinosaurian evolution, producing ecosystems of extraordinary richness and sophistication, from the floor of the western interior seaway to the canopy of the polar forests. The diversity was real, The sophistication was real. The ecological interconnections, the predator-prey relationships, the plant-herbivore coevolutions, the intricate dependencies between species that build up over millions of years of shared existence were real, and they were deep. And if the rock had missed, if the trajectory had been different, if the timing had been off by those crucial few minutes, this world would not have ended. It would have continued. Not unchanged, because nothing in the living world ever truly stays the same, but continuous, unbroken, with all of its accumulated evolutionary heritage intact, and with whatever direction that heritage might have taken given more time. The question of what direction that would have been, what 66 million more years of dinosaurian evolution would have produced, is what the rest of this story is about. 1 million years is already beyond ordinary human comprehension. A span so vast that the entire recorded history of human civilization, every empire and dynasty and written language ever produced, would fit into its final few thousand years without filling even a fraction of it. 10 million years is 10 times that. 100 million years is 100 times that. And yet the dinosaurs had already existed for over 160 million years by the time the late Cretaceous drew toward its close. To ask what would have happened if the asteroid never came is, in a very real sense, to ask what happens when an already ancient and deeply successful group of animals is given even more time, more millions of years, more opportunities to diversify, to specialize, to spread, to adapt, more chances to respond to the slow, grinding pressures of changing climates, shifting continents, and evolving ecosystems. What does evolution do with that kind of time? The answer, drawn from everything we understand about how life changes and adapts across geological timescales, is both humbling and extraordinary. It produces things we cannot fully anticipate. It follows paths that seem inevitable in hindsight, but would have been nearly impossible to predict in advance. It builds complexity from simplicity and strangeness from the familiar. And so, if the asteroid had not come, if that 12-kilometer rock had missed Earth entirely, sweeping past our planet in the silence of space, its shadow briefly darkening the clouds below, before it disappeared into the outer solar system, what would the dinosaurs have done with another 66 million years of life on Earth? The first thing to understand is that the late Cretaceous world was not a static place even before the impact. The Earth of 66 million years ago was already in a state of gradual, long-term change. The climate, while broadly warm and humid, was showing signs of slow cooling in certain regions. The shallow inland seas that had divided the continents were beginning to recede as ocean floor spreading patterns shifted. The continents themselves were continuing their slow drift toward the positions we recognize today. And in the biological world, the forces of evolution were not sitting still. New species were appearing. Old lineages were shifting their ranges, adapting to new conditions, going extinct in one region while flourishing in another. The late Cretaceous was not a frozen snapshot of a timeless world. It was a living or dynamic ecosystem in constant, if slow, motion. This matters enormously for our alternate history, because in a world without the asteroid impact, the dinosaurs would not simply have continued exactly as they were indefinitely. Life does not work that way. The same processes that had shaped the dinosaurs over the previous 160 million years would have continued to act upon them. Natural selection, genetic mutation, ecological competition, geographic isolation, climate change. The dinosaurs of 10 million years after the non-impact would have been somewhat different from the dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous. The dinosaurs of 50 million years after would have been different still. The dinosaurs of 66 million years after. The dinosaurs of our present day, in this imagined world, might have been almost unrecognizable compared to Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus. But they would have been dinosaurs nonetheless, and they would have been the dominant large animals on Earth. Let us begin with the most iconic of them all, the theropod lineage, the great two-legged carnivores that had produced some of the most spectacular predators in Earth's history. Tyrannosaurus rex, as it existed in the late Cretaceous, was already a highly specialized predator, one that had evolved over tens of millions of years into a very particular ecological role. It was a bone-crushing ambush predator, likely capable of short bursts of speed, with a bite force unmatched by any land predator before or since. Its arms were famously small and antecessor, but this was almost certainly not a random or disadvantageous feature. It may have been an adaptation that shifted the center of gravity forward, improving balance during feeding, or that reduced the risk of forelimb injury during the violent struggles that accompanied large prey. In a world without extinction, Tyrannosaurus and its close relatives would have continued to evolve under the pressures of their environment. And here, the science of evolutionary biology offers us some reasonable expectations. Large apex predators tend to diversify over time when given sufficient geographic space and ecological opportunity. The tyrannosaur lineage had already demonstrated this tendency during the Cretaceous. Tyrannosaurs existed across North America and Asia in a variety of sizes and ecological niches, from the enormous Tyrannosaurus rex itself to the smaller, faster, longer-armed relatives that had preceded it in earlier epochs. Given more time, this diversification would likely have continued. Some lineages of tyrannosaur might have trended toward greater size if their prey base supported it. Others might have evolved toward greater speed and agility, competing with the smaller dromaeosaurids and troodontids for medium-sized prey. Still others might have shifted their ecological role, becoming more generalist omnivores, as some modern large predators such as bears have done over their own evolutionary history. The arms of the tyrannosaur lineage are an interesting evolutionary question in their own right. The forelimbs of Tyrannosaurus were tiny compared to its body, but they were not useless. They were heavily muscled and likely functional in certain behaviors, possibly related to rising from a resting position or to grasping prey during feeding. Over millions of years of further evolution, with shifting ecological pressures, the forelimbs of tyrannosaur descendants might have continued to shrink, becoming vestigial. Or they might, under different circumstances, have reversed course, slowly lengthening again as new ecological roles demanded greater forelimb capability. Evolution is not a straight line. It backtracks, it shifts direction, It follows the path of least resistance toward survival and reproduction. What the tyrannosaur lineage would have produced over 66 million additional years of evolution is genuinely uncertain. But whatever it was, it would almost certainly have retained the basic body plan that made the tyrannosaurs so successful. The powerful hind limbs, the large skull, the binocular vision, the extraordinary sensory capability. Across the ocean, in the land masses of what would become Asia, Europe, and South America, other lineages of theropod dinosaurs would have continued their own evolutionary journeys. The abelisaurids, a group of large theropods that had dominated the southern continents throughout much of the Cretaceous, were, in many ways, the southern hemisphere's answer to the tyrannosaurs. They were robust, powerful predators with unusually short, deep skulls and even more reduced forelimbs than the tyrannosaurs. The abelisaur arm was, by the late Cretaceous, almost comically small, tiny, with reduced joints and minimal muscle attachment points. It is generally assumed by paleontologists that the abelisaur forelimbs were essentially non-functional, perhaps retained purely as evolutionary vestiges. In a post-Cretaceous world, the abelisaurids would have continued to evolve across South America, Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. As these landmasses continued their geological drift, South America and Africa moving further apart, India eventually colliding with Asia, the isolated populations of abelisaurids on each continent would have followed separate evolutionary paths. New species would have emerged. Geographic isolation over millions of years would have produced distinct lineages as different from one another as a modern tiger is from a modern lion, or as different as a wolf is from a coyote. In the forests and plains of South America, our abelisaur descendants might have evolved alongside the large titanosaur sauropods that persisted in that region. Long-necked, enormous plant eaters that had survived in South America, even as sauropod diversity declined elsewhere in the world. The predator-prey relationship between large theropods and large sauropods had driven evolutionary arms races for tens of millions of years in the Mesozoic. Given more time, these arms races would have continued, each lineage adapting in response to the other. Faster predators driving the evolution of larger, more defensively built prey. Larger prey, in turn, driving the evolution of stronger, more powerful predators. Among the herbivorous dinosaurs, the picture is equally rich with evolutionary possibility. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs, were, by the late Cretaceous, and among the most successful and diverse dinosaur groups on Earth. They were found across North America, Asia, Europe, and South America. Their dental batteries, those extraordinarily efficient grinding teeth, gave them access to a wide range of plant food that other herbivores could not process as effectively. Their social behavior, evident from the enormous bone beds and the elaborate cranial crests found in many species, suggests a level of behavioral complexity that might have been a foundation for further development over millions of additional years. In a world without extinction, the hadrosaur lineage would have continued to diversify. New species would have emerged in different environments, adapting to new plant communities as the climate slowly changed. Some lineages might have moved into drier, more open environments as the world gradually cooled over the tens of millions of years following the Cretaceous. Others might have remained in dense riparian forests along river systems, following the same ecological strategy that had served them so well for so long. The cranial crests of the hadrosaurs are particularly interesting in an evolutionary context. In many species, Parasaurolophus being the most famous example, these crests were hollow, connecting directly to the nasal passages, and almost certainly functioning as resonating chambers for vocal communication. The diversity of crest shapes across hadrosaur species suggests that these structures were subject to strong sexual selection, that the size, shape, and possibly the acoustic properties of the crest were factors in mate choice. This kind of sexually selected trait tends to evolve rapidly, at least in geological terms, producing rapid diversification of visual and acoustic signals within a lineage. Over millions of years, the hadrosaur crests might have become even more elaborate, more varied, more structurally complex, more closely integrated with social behavior. The communication systems of the hadrosaurs might have developed in ways that pushed the boundaries of what we normally associate with non-human animals. Not language in any human sense, but complex, structured vocalizations. A rich acoustic social world, layered and intricate, developed over tens of millions of years of elaboration. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, present another compelling evolutionary story. By the late Cretaceous, the ceratopsians had already produced an extraordinary diversity of horn and frill configurations across dozens of species. The frill, that bony extension of the skull that formed a large, often ornamented, sometimes colorful display structure at the back of the head, varied enormously between species. Some frills were short and simple. Others were long and swept back dramatically, edged with elaborate bony projections called epiccipitals that could be straight, curved, or bifurcated. Some frills bore large fenestrae, openings covered in life by skin, that may have flushed with color as a display signal. The horns themselves were equally variable. Some ceratopsians bore a single large nasal horn and two long brow horns, arranged like triceratops. Others had multiple smaller horns arranged in elaborate patterns across the face, and some had long, swept-back brow horns that curved forward at the tips. The variety suggests that horn configuration was under intense selective pressure, perhaps for species recognition, mate choice, and combat with rivals, all simultaneously. In a world without the extinction event, the ceratopsian lineage would have had tens of millions of years to continue this elaboration. New species would have emerged on different continents as geographic barriers shifted with the movement of tectonic plates. Each isolated population, subject to its own local selective pressures and its own random mutations, would have followed a slightly different evolutionary trajectory. The result, over geological time, might have been a ceratopsian diversity as rich and varied as the diversity of modern bovids. The group that includes modern cattle, buffalo, and antelope, goats, and sheep, a group that has produced an astonishing range of horn and body configurations over the past few million years. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of any speculative exploration of a post-Cretaceous dinosaur world is the question of how dinosaurs would have responded to the very real and significant environmental changes that have occurred over the past 66 million years. Because the world has not been static since the Cretaceous. Quite the opposite. The most significant long-term change has been cooling. The warm, largely ice-free world of the Cretaceous has, over the tens of millions of years since, gradually cooled. The continents have shifted into positions that have altered ocean circulation patterns, affecting the distribution of heat around the globe. Antarctica drifted over the South Pole and became glaciated. Mountain ranges rose. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Rockies, as tectonic plates collided and crumpled, creating new rain shadows and altering regional climates. The gradual drawdown of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over geological time has played a role in global cooling as well. By approximately 2.5 million years ago, these gradual changes had crossed a threshold into what we call the Pleistocene ice ages, a period of recurring cyclical glaciations in which enormous ice sheets spread across the northern hemisphere and then retreated in cycles driven by subtle variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun. In our world, it was during the Pleistocene that the large mammal fauna of the world was shaped into what we know today. It was during this period that elephants, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave lions, and giant deer all flourished, and then, in many cases, disappeared, driven to extinction by a combination of climate change and the arrival of a particularly effective new predator, the humans. In our alternate world, in the world where the asteroid never came, the dinosaurs would have faced this same long-term cooling trend. And the question of how they would have responded is genuinely fascinating. We already know from the fossil record that some dinosaurs could tolerate cool conditions quite well. Evidence from high-latitude Cretaceous sites in Alaska, Siberia, and Antarctica shows that dinosaurs lived in polar regions where they would have experienced months of winter darkness and temperatures well below what most modern reptiles can tolerate. This suggests that at least some dinosaur lineages had already evolved mechanisms for dealing with cold, perhaps metabolic adaptations that allowed them to remain active at lower temperatures, perhaps insulating coverings of feathers or proto-feathers, perhaps behavioral strategies such as migration or dormancy. The presence of feathers in many theropod lineages is particularly relevant here. Feathers, in their original function, are excellent insulators, as the discovery over the past 3 decades of dozens of feathered theropod species, confirmed by exquisitely preserved fossils from China and other sites, has fundamentally changed our understanding of dinosaur biology. Many small and medium-sized theropods were feathered. There is some evidence, though it remains debated, that juvenile tyrannosaurs may have had feathers as well. The feathered condition in theropods was likely ancestral. It was the baseline from which the group had evolved, with some lineages secondarily losing their feather covering as they grew to very large body sizes. In a cooling world, feathers would have been an enormous advantage. The theropod lineages that already possessed feathering would have been well positioned to expand into cooler environments as the climate shifted over millions of years. Natural selection acting on the existing variation in feather density, structure, and coverage, would have gradually refined and improved the insulating function of feathers in lineages facing colder conditions. The large-bodied theropods, the tyrannosaur descendants, the abelisaurids, would have faced a different challenge. Large body size itself provides some thermal inertia. Large animals lose heat more slowly than small animals, simply because of the ratio of volume to surface area. But in genuinely cold climates, even large animals benefit from active insulation. The question of how the large theropods would have responded to a cooling world is one of the more intriguing puzzles in this alternate evolutionary history. Among the ornithischian dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, and their relatives, the evidence for feather-like or bristle-like structures is more limited but not absent. Some members of the ornithischian group, including the small heterodontosaurids, show evidence of filamentous structures that may have provided some degree of insulation. If this condition was more widespread than the fossil record currently suggests, ornithischians would have had more evolutionary raw material to work with as climates cooled. But even without feathers, large herbivorous dinosaurs might have managed well in a cooling world through other means. Modern large herbivores such as elephants, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses live in warm environments. It is true. But their Pleistocene relatives, including the woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros, had evolved thick fur coats and other cold weather adaptations in response to glacial conditions. The same basic evolutionary process, selection for insulation in cold climates, acting on existing genetic variation, would have been available to the large herbivorous dinosaurs. Hadrosaur descendants, living in progressively cooler northern regions, might have gradually evolved thicker, more insulating body coverings. Ceratopsian descendants might have done the same. The exact nature of these adaptations, whether they would have taken the form of feathers, hair-like structures, thick scales, or something else entirely, is impossible to predict with certainty. But the pressure toward better cold weather insulation would have been real, and evolution tends to find solutions to real selective pressures, given enough time. The diversification of new dinosaur species is perhaps the most expansive and imaginative aspect of this entire speculation. 66 million years is a long time. For reference, it is roughly the same amount of time that has passed since the actual extinction event, the time during which all of modern mammalian diversity, from shrews to whales, from bats to elephants, from rodents to primates, has evolved from small, unassuming ancestors. In 66 million years, mammals went from survivors hiding in burrows to dominant animals filling every large ecological role on Earth, colonizing the oceans as whales and dolphins, taking to the skies as bats, developing extraordinary intelligence and social complexity in the primate lineage. What 66 million years of evolution might have done with the dinosaurs is staggering to contemplate. Entirely new ecological roles might have been invented and filled. Dinosaurs had, in their history, already produced an extraordinary range of forms, but they had not exhausted the possibilities of animal body design. Some paleontologists have speculated that, given more time, certain dinosaur lineages might have evolved toward greater aquatic specialization, moving into freshwater and coastal marine environments in ways analogous to the evolution of modern semi-aquatic mammals like otters, hippos, and eventually whales. The semi-aquatic spinosaurids of the Cretaceous suggest that this kind of ecological transition was not beyond the reach of theropod biology. Others might have moved toward greater arboreal specialization, living in trees in the way that modern monkeys and apes do, using forelimbs and tails for balance and manipulation in ways that the Cretaceous dinosaurs had only begun to explore. The small, agile dromaeosaurids, relatives of the famous velociraptor, were already showing tendencies toward climbing and agility. Given tens of millions of years of further evolution, some of their descendants might have become accomplished tree dwellers, their bodies reshaped by selection for grasping, leaping, and moving through a three-dimensional arboreal world. The birds deserve special attention in this alternate history because they present a unique and fascinating case. Birds are not separate from dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs, a lineage of small, feathered theropods that had been evolving since the Jurassic period. In our world, after the mass extinction wiped out their non-avian relatives, the birds diversified explosively, radiating into the ecological spaces left vacant by the extinct large dinosaurs, eventually producing the roughly 10,000 species that exist today. In a world without the extinction, the birds would not have had this opportunity for explosive radiation. The ecological spaces they might otherwise have filled would have remained occupied by non-avian dinosaurs. The birds would have continued to evolve and diversify, certainly, but they would have done so in a world already dominated by their larger relatives. What would have happened to the birds in this world is genuinely uncertain. They might have remained in roughly the ecological roles they occupied in the late Cretaceous, small to medium-sized animals filling aerial and semi-aerial niches, coexisting with the non-avian dinosaurs rather than replacing them. Or competitive pressures might have pushed them into even more specialized ecological roles, deeper into the forests, higher into the mountains, further out to sea, places where the larger non-avian dinosaurs could not easily follow. The diversity of birds today, from the tiny hummingbird to the large flightless ostrich, from the deep-water diving penguin to the soaring albatross, gives some sense of how flexible and adaptable the avian body plan has proven to be. In an alternate world, the birds might have produced a different but equally rich tapestry of forms and are shaped by the ecological constraints of a dinosaur-dominated landscape, rather than the open opportunity of a post-extinction world. One of the enduring questions in the study of evolution is whether the history of life on Earth follows predictable paths, or whether it is essentially contingent, meaning that different starting conditions would produce entirely different outcomes, with no reliable way to predict which way evolution will go. The paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould famously argued for contingency, that if you rewound the tape of life and played it again, you would get something entirely different. Other scientists have argued for convergence, the idea that similar environments and ecological pressures tend to produce similar evolutionary solutions, regardless of the starting point. The repeated, independent evolution of eyes in different animal lineages, of wings in insects and birds and bats and pterosaurs, of streamlined body forms in fish and dolphins and ichthyosaurs. These suggest that evolution, given similar challenges, tends to find similar solutions. The truth likely lies somewhere between these two views. Evolution is both contingent and convergent. The broad strokes of what happens, predators and prey, large herbivores and diverse plant communities, aerial animals and aquatic specialists, tend to repeat across different evolutionary histories. The specific details, the exact shapes and sizes and behaviors of the animals that fill those roles, vary more freely. What this means for our alternate dinosaur world is that the broad outline of the ecosystem, 66 million years after the non-impact, would likely have been recognizable in its general structure. Predators and prey, herbivores and omnivores, aerial animals, aquatic animals, animals of different sizes filling a hierarchy of ecological roles. But the specific animals filling those roles would have been profoundly different from anything alive today. They would have been dinosaurs, shaped by 66 million additional years of evolution, responding to the same real-world changes in climate, geography, and ecology that have shaped the history of life on Earth since the Cretaceous. The world that these evolved dinosaurs would have inhabited would have looked, in its broad geographical outlines, much like the world we know today. The continents would have drifted to roughly their current positions. The Himalayas would have risen as India collided with Asia. The Atlantic Ocean would have widened to its current breadth. Antarctica would be encased in ice. The Isthmus of Panama would have connected North and South America, as it did about 3 million years ago in our own timeline, allowing animals to cross between the continents for the first time in tens of millions of years. That last event, the Great American Biotic Interchange, as it is called in our own history, would have been as dramatic in the alternate timeline as it was in the real one. When North and South American dinosaur faunas met each other for the first time, the ecological consequences would have been profound. Species that had evolved in isolation on one continent would have suddenly been in competition and predator-prey relationships with species they had never before encountered. Some would have thrived in the new conditions. Others would have gone extinct, outcompeted or outpredated by the arrivals from the other continent. These kinds of large-scale ecological disruptions have, throughout the real history of life on Earth, been powerful drivers of evolutionary change. They create new pressures, new opportunities, new arms races. They accelerate diversification in some lineages and drive others to extinction. They are, in their own way, smaller-scale versions of the kind of ecological upheaval that a mass extinction event creates. And they tend to produce rapid, dramatic evolutionary responses. In the alternate timeline, the mixing of North and South American dinosaur faunas would have been one of the great evolutionary events of the post-Cretaceous world. Its outcomes would have been impossible to predict in detail, but its effects would have been felt across both continents for millions of years. So the picture that emerges, when we think carefully about what a dinosaur-dominated world might have looked like 66 million years after the non-impact, is not of a world frozen in the late Cretaceous. a world of Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus, living unchanged through geological time. That is not how evolution works, and it is not how life has ever worked on this planet. The world of the alternate present would have been a world of evolved dinosaurs. Creatures descended from the familiar species of the Cretaceous, and shaped by tens of millions of years of evolutionary change into forms we would not immediately recognize. Some might have been larger than their Cretaceous ancestors, some smaller. Some would have moved into ecological roles that were entirely novel. Some would have evolved behavioral and cognitive capabilities far beyond anything seen in the Cretaceous. The forests would still have been full of life. The Great Plains, which would have developed as grasslands spread across the cooling, drying continents during what we call the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, would have been grazed by large herds of herbivorous dinosaurs rather than the antelopes, wildebeest, and horses that fill those roles in our world. The predators would have been dinosaurian rather than mammalian. The skies would have been shared between evolved birds and their non-avian dinosaurian relatives. And the small mammals, the quiet, persistent survivors of the Cretaceous, would still have been there, tucked into the corners of the ecosystem, small and furred and warm-blooded, doing what they had always done, surviving, persisting, waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for an opportunity that, in this alternate world, would never come. For over 160 million years, through the Triassic, through the Jurassic, through the long sweep of the Cretaceous, the mammals were there. They were always there. They did not disappear. They did not falter entirely. They simply endured, in their small and careful way, occupying the narrow ecological spaces that the dinosaurs had left available to them. Generation after generation, million of years after million of years, their lineages branching and shifting and slowly diversifying in the margins of a world that was not, in any meaningful sense, built for them. It is one of the great ironies of evolutionary history that the animals who would one day produce elephants and whales and eagles and human beings spent the better part of their early existence as small, furtive, largely nocturnal creatures, and creeping through the leaf litter at the feet of the most spectacular animals that had ever walked the earth. But irony, of course, is a human concept. Evolution has no sense of drama, no appreciation for reversals of fortune. It does not know that the small, trembling mammal hiding in the root hollow of a Cretaceous tree is the ancestor of everything that will one day dominate the planet. It simply acts, selecting for survival, for reproduction, for the traits that allow an animal to leave more descendants than its neighbors. And in the Cretaceous world, the traits that allowed mammals to leave descendants were, almost without exception, traits associated with smallness, with hiddenness, with flexibility and generalism, and the ability to survive on whatever food was available, wherever it could be found, and with the capacity to reproduce quickly, so that even if most offspring were lost to predation, enough would survive to carry the lineage forward. These were not the traits of world dominators, but they were the traits of survivors. And in our alternate history, in the world where the asteroid never came, survival is all the mammals would have had. To understand why mammals might never have risen to dominance in a world where the dinosaurs continued to flourish, it is necessary to understand something fundamental about how ecosystems work. Ecosystems are not simply collections of animals living side by side. They are structured, interconnected webs of relationships: predator and prey, herbivore and plant, parasite and host, competitor and competitor. Within these webs, every ecological role, every niche, in the scientific terminology, tends to be occupied. And once a niche is occupied by a well-adapted species, it is extraordinarily difficult for another species to displace it. This is not because ecosystems are perfectly balanced or static. They are not. Species go locally extinct all the time. Populations fluctuate. New competitors arrive and disrupt established relationships. But the general principle holds. A thriving, well-adapted occupant of an ecological niche is a formidable obstacle to any other species attempting to move into that same role. In the late Cretaceous, the dinosaurs occupied virtually every large animal ecological role available on land. The large herbivore niches, the grazer, the browser, the mixed feeder, were held by hadrosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, and sauropods. The large predator niches were held by tyrannosaurs, abelisaurids, and other large theropods. The medium-sized omnivore niches were held by ornithomimosaurs, oviraptorosaurs, and various smaller theropods. Even the more specialized roles, the insect eater, the small vertebrate predator, the egg specialist, were occupied by small dinosaurs and early birds. The mammals had found a way to exist within this fully occupied ecosystem, but only by confining themselves to the ecological spaces the dinosaurs had not claimed. Small body size, nocturnal activity, burrowing habits, generalist diets focused on insects, seeds, small vertebrates, and whatever organic material could be found in the leaf litter and undergrowth. In a world where the dinosaurs never went extinct, where they continued to thrive and diversify for tens of millions of additional years, the ecological niche structure that had constrained the mammals for the entire Mesozoic would have persisted. There would have been no sudden opening, no vacuum of opportunity created by a mass extinction event. The table would have remained set, every seat occupied, every role filled by animals that had been filling it successfully for millions of years. And yet it would be an oversimplification to say that the mammals would have remained entirely unchanged, entirely static in such a world. Evolution does not stop simply because an animal is constrained. It acts continuously, on every generation, on every individual, selecting for whatever traits improve survival and reproduction in the current environment. And the environment of the mammals, even a constrained, small animal environment, is not without its own selective pressures, its own challenges, its own opportunities for change. Over millions of years, even within the ecological spaces available to them, the mammals would have continued to evolve. Their teeth would have continued to diversify in response to changes in the available food supply. Their sensory systems would have continued to be refined. Better smell, better low-light vision, better hearing. Their reproductive strategies might have shifted in various directions, some lineages producing fewer, more developed offspring. others retaining the rapid reproduction strategy that serves small mammals so well in a world full of predators. Their brains, importantly, would have continued to develop. The mammalian brain is already, in the Cretaceous, something special. Mammals possess a neocortex, a layered, folded outer region of the brain associated with higher-order sensory processing, complex behavior, and, in its most developed form, the cognitive capabilities we associate with intelligence. No other animal group of the Cretaceous, not the dinosaurs, not the crocodilians, not the turtles, possessed anything quite like it. The mammalian neocortex had been developing since the Triassic, shaped by the demands of nocturnal, complex environment life. The need to process rich sensory information from smell and hearing in the darkness. To navigate complex three-dimensional environments. To remember the locations of food sources and predators. In a world without the extinction event, the mammalian brain would have continued to slowly develop over millions of years, even in small-bodied animals. It is possible, even likely, that the mammals of a dinosaur-dominated world, tens of millions of years after the non-impact, would have been notably more cognitively sophisticated than the Cretaceous mammals we know from the fossil record. Not intelligent in any human sense, not even necessarily as intelligent as a modern rat or mouse, but sharper, more complex, more neurologically capable than their Cretaceous ancestors. The question of body size is perhaps the most critical one in any assessment of mammalian potential in a dinosaur-dominated world. In our actual world, of the explosive diversification of mammals after the mass extinction was accompanied by an equally explosive increase in body size. Within 10 million years of the extinction event, a relatively short time in geological terms, mammals had already produced animals the size of modern pigs and sheep. Within 20 million years, they had produced animals the size of modern rhinoceroses. Within 40 million years, the largest land mammals that ever existed were walking the earth. Enormous creatures like Paraceratherium, a hornless relative of the rhinoceros that stood nearly 5 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed as much as 15 to 20 tons. This size increase was possible because the extinction of the dinosaurs had vacated the large animal ecological roles. There was suddenly an enormous amount of food, vegetation on prey animals, that no large animal was consuming. Any mammal lineage that began to trend toward larger body size would have found itself with access to food resources that had previously been monopolized by the dinosaurs. Size, therefore, was immediately and strongly favored by natural selection. In a world where the dinosaurs never went extinct, this selective pressure for mammalian size increase would not have existed. The large animal food resources would have remained monopolized by dinosaurs. A mammal that began to trend toward larger body size would not have found an open landscape of opportunity. It would have found itself in direct competition with animals that were already far better adapted to filling that role. The larger the mammal grew, the more directly it would have competed with the dinosaurian incumbents. And the dinosaurian incumbents, with hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement behind them, would have been extraordinarily difficult to displace. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called competitive exclusion. sometimes known as Gauss's law, after the Russian biologist who formalized it in the 1930s. The principle states that two species competing for exactly the same ecological resource in the same way cannot coexist indefinitely. One will always have some slight advantage that allows it to gradually outcompete the other, until the less successful species is either driven to extinction or forced to shift to a slightly different ecological role. In practice, competitive exclusion is rarely as clean and absolute as the theoretical principle suggests. Real ecological systems are complex, and small differences in habitat use, diet, activity pattern, and reproductive strategy can allow two apparently similar species to coexist by occupying subtly different niches. But the underlying principle is sound. Where two species are in direct, sustained competition for the same resource, the better adapted one tends to win. In a dinosaur-dominated world, any mammal lineage attempting to grow larger and compete directly with the dinosaurian large herbivores or large predators would have faced this competitive pressure in an acute form. The dinosaurian competitors would not have been marginally better adapted. They would have been profoundly better adapted, the products of millions of years of evolutionary refinement for exactly those ecological roles. The mammals, by contrast, would have been ecological novices in those niches, their bodies and physiologies shaped by millions of years of small animal life. The likely outcome, across most scenarios, would have been the continued suppression of mammalian body size. Not through any active process. The dinosaurs were not deliberately keeping the mammals small, but through the simple, implacable logic of competition. Every time a mammal lineage began to trend toward larger size, it would have encountered increased competition and predation pressure from dinosaurs already adapted to that size range. The lineages that stayed small would have survived and reproduced more successfully than those that grew larger, and so, generation after generation, the mammals would have been held in their small-bodied niche by the invisible force of natural selection, acting in the context of a dinosaur-dominated ecosystem. And yet, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, there may have been exceptions. Ecological opportunity does not always come in the form of a mass extinction. It can come in smaller, more localized packages. Geographic isolation, for example, can create conditions where a group of animals finds itself free from its usual competitors and predators, allowing it to diversify in ways that would be impossible in a fully occupied ecosystem. The history of life on isolated islands and continents is full of examples of this. The marsupials of Australia, freed from competition with placental mammals for much of their history, diversifying into ecological roles filled elsewhere by placentals. The strange endemic mammals of Madagascar, evolving in isolation from the main African fauna, the extraordinary radiation of finches on the Galapagos Islands. In our alternate history, certain geographic regions might have offered the mammals similar opportunities. As the continents continued to drift over the tens of millions of years following the non-impact Cretaceous, new islands and island chains would have formed and disappeared, as they always have throughout geological history. Volcanic islands rising from the ocean floor, continental fragments separated by expanding ocean basins. peninsulas periodically isolated by rising sea levels. On some of these isolated land masses, the dinosaur fauna might have been limited. Perhaps only a few species made it to a newly formed island, or perhaps the island's small size and limited resources could not support the largest dinosaur species. In these places, the competitive pressure on mammals would have been reduced, and reduced competitive pressure, even modestly, might have been enough to allow some mammal lineages to grow slightly larger, to occupy slightly broader ecological roles, to diversify in modest but meaningful ways. The mammals of these isolated regions might have evolved into forms somewhat larger and ecologically broader than their mainland counterparts, perhaps reaching the size of a modern rabbit or a small dog, filling roles as small to medium-sized herbivores and omnivores on islands where the dinosaurian competition was limited. These would not have been the world-dominating mammals of our actual Cenozoic era. They would have been modest exceptions to the general rule of mammalian smallness in a dinosaur world. But they would have represented the outer edge of what the mammals could achieve without the dinosaurs' removal. The question of whether intelligence might have emerged in mammals in a dinosaur-dominated world is one of the most profound and difficult questions in this entire speculation. In our world, high intelligence evolved in several independent mammalian lineages, most prominently in the primates, the cetaceans, and the elephants. Each of these groups evolved large, complex brains through somewhat different pathways, in response to somewhat different ecological and social pressures. But they share certain common features. They are all relatively large-bodied animals. They are all highly social. They all live in complex, information-rich environments that reward cognitive flexibility. And they all have relatively long lifespans, which allows time for extended learning and complex social relationships to develop. In a dinosaur-dominated world, most of these conditions would have been absent from the mammalian experience. The mammals would have remained small, and small brains, limited by body size, can only achieve a certain level of cognitive complexity, regardless of how strong the selective pressure for intelligence might be. The neurons of a small brain simply cannot form the vast interconnected networks that underlie high-order cognition in large-brained animals. The physics of brain size places a ceiling on cognitive capability that no amount of evolutionary pressure can easily overcome in a small body. This does not mean that the small mammals of a dinosaur-dominated world would have been unintelligent. As noted earlier, the mammalian brain would have continued to develop slowly over millions of years. The small mammals of a world 66 million years after the non-impact might have been considerably more cognitively capable than the small mammals of the Cretaceous. But the leap from small, clever insectivore to the kind of large, socially complex, cognitively sophisticated animal that eventually gave rise to human intelligence would have required an increase in body size. And that increase in body size would have remained largely blocked by the ecological constraints of a dinosaur-dominated world. There are some scenarios under which mammalian intelligence might have had a slightly better chance of developing. Even in a dinosaur world, one involves the long-term cooling of the climate. As the world gradually cooled over the tens of millions of years following the Cretaceous, the warm, lush environments that the dinosaurs had evolved to exploit would have slowly contracted. Cooler, drier, more seasonal environments, grasslands, open woodlands, steppe, would have expanded. These are environments in which the metabolic advantages of mammalian warm-bloodedness become more pronounced. Reptiles, including the dinosaurs, regulate their body temperature through behavior, moving into sunlight to warm up, seeking shade to cool down. This strategy works well in warm, stable climates, but becomes increasingly costly in cold, variable ones. A dinosaur in a harsh, seasonal environment must spend significant time and energy managing its body temperature, time and energy that cannot be spent on finding food or reproducing. Mammals, on being fully endothermic, generating their own body heat from metabolism, do not face this constraint in the same way. They can remain active in cold, dark, variable environments that would force reptiles into lethargy. This is a significant advantage in the kind of cooler, more seasonal world that has characterized much of the Earth's history over the past 30 million years. If the long-term cooling trend had significantly reduced dinosaur diversity and dominance in the higher latitudes, pushing them toward the equatorial regions where warm climates persisted, the mammals in those cooler regions might have experienced a reduction in competitive pressure. In the open, cooler grasslands and forests of high latitudes, with fewer dinosaurs competing for resources, some mammal lineages might have begun to grow larger and to diversify more broadly, to occupy ecological roles previously held by dinosaurs. This would not have been a rapid process. Even with reduced competition, the mammals would have faced the challenge of being ecologically inexperienced in large animal roles. Their bodies, their physiologies, their behaviors all shaped by millions of years of small animal life. The transition to larger body size and broader ecological roles would have been gradual, tentative, and geologically slow. But over millions of years, in the cooler regions of a gradually chilling world, a modest mammalian expansion might have been possible. Not the explosive Cenozoic radiation that produced whales and elephants and primates in our world. Something quieter, more limited, more constrained. Perhaps mammals reaching the size of modern pigs or small deer in the cooler latitudes, filling the roles of small to medium-sized herbivores and omnivores in ecosystems where the dinosaurs had become less dominant due to the cold. It is worth pausing, in this context, to consider the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, and what their counterparts might have been in a dinosaur world. The ocean, in our alternate history, presents a somewhat different picture from the land. The land ecosystems would have remained firmly dinosaur-dominated. But the oceans are a different matter. In our actual world, the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous devastated marine life as thoroughly as it devastated life on land. The mosasaurs, the great marine lizards, went extinct entirely, along with the plesiosaurs, the ammonites, and enormous numbers of marine invertebrates. The recovery of marine ecosystems after the extinction took millions of years, and it was during this recovery that early cetaceans, descended from small, land-dwelling, hoofed mammals, first began the transition to aquatic life, eventually giving rise to the dolphins and whales we know today. In a world without the extinction, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs would have survived. They had occupied the large predator roles in the marine ecosystem for tens of millions of years and were extremely well adapted to that role. Any mammal attempting the transition to an aquatic lifestyle would have found the marine large predator niches thoroughly occupied. However, the ocean is vast, and its ecological structure is complex. It is possible that some mammal lineages might have found a path to aquatic life in niches that the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs did not fully exploit, perhaps as filter feeders in the open ocean, analogous to modern baleen whales, or as small to medium-sized coastal fish hunters in shallow inshore environments. The fossil record of our own world shows that the transition to aquatic life in mammals was driven by specific ecological opportunities, not by some inherent tendency of mammals toward the ocean. In a different ecological context, the opportunities might have been different, smaller, more constrained, but perhaps not entirely absent. The broader picture that emerges from this careful consideration of mammalian potential in a dinosaur world is one of persistent, quiet limitation. The mammals would have survived, and they would have continued to evolve. They would have diversified, in modest ways, within the ecological spaces available to them. In isolated regions, on islands, in the cooler latitudes of a gradually chilling world, they might have achieved sizes and ecological roles somewhat beyond what the Cretaceous mammals had managed. But the great radiation, the explosive diversification into elephants and whales and horses and bats and primates, would almost certainly not have occurred. The ecological space required for that kind of radiation would have remained occupied by the dinosaurs. The competitive barriers would have been too high, the selective pressures in the wrong direction, the opportunities too limited for the mammals to break through the ceiling that the dinosaurs imposed upon them. And without the great mammalian radiation and the primate lineage, the group that would eventually give rise to monkeys, apes, and human beings, would never have come into existence. There would have been no arboreal primates swinging through tropical forest canopies, no great apes knuckle-walking through African forests, no upright, large-brained hominids walking out across the African savanna 2 or 3 million years ago, picking up stones, learning to shape them, learning to use fire, learning to talk. No humans. Or at least, not the humans we know, not the particular primate lineage with its particular brain architecture and its particular social complexity and its particular capacity for language and technology and reflection. The specific evolutionary path that led to us was contingent on an enormous number of historical accidents and conditions, and the most fundamental of which was the removal of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Without that removal, the entire subsequent history of life on Earth would have taken a different course. Whether any other lineage, mammalian or dinosaurian, might have eventually arrived at something like human-level intelligence is a separate question, and one that the next chapters of this story will explore in careful, unhurried detail. But for now, it is enough to sit with this image. A world of 66 million years of uninterrupted dinosaur dominance. A world where the forests are rich and the plains are wide and the predators are ancient and perfectly adapted. A world where the small mammals still creep through the undergrowth at night, still hide in their burrows during the long, warm days, and still eat their insects and their seeds and their small invertebrates, still raise their tiny, helpless young with the warmth of their bodies and the richness of their milk, still surviving, still persisting, still waiting, unknowingly, without intention or hope, for an opportunity that will never arrive. The mammals of this alternate world are not failures. They are, in their own way, a remarkable evolutionary success. They have persisted against all odds in the margins of a world built for something else entirely. Their warm blood, their complex brains, their versatile teeth, their caring social bonds, all of it refined over millions of years of constrained but continuous evolution. But they will not rule this world. This world belongs to the dinosaurs. It has always belonged to the dinosaurs. And in this quiet, warm, and ancient world, this world of deep forests and sunlit plains and great herds moving through river valleys under an open sky, that, for the foreseeable future, is simply how things are. To understand what a dinosaur-dominated world would look like today, it helps to step back from individual animals and look at the broader canvas, the ecosystems, the biomes, the living communities that would have covered the planet's surface across 66 million years of uninterrupted dinosaurian evolution. What emerges, when you look at it carefully, is a world both deeply familiar and profoundly strange. Familiar in its broad geography and its fundamental ecological logic. Energy flowing from sun to plant to herbivore to predator. The same physics and chemistry governing the same oceans and atmosphere. Strange in its details, in the specific forms of life filling its ecological roles, in the textures and sounds and biological relationships that 66 million years of a different evolutionary history would have produced. Begin with the plants, because the plants underlie everything. In our actual world, one of the most dramatic ecological changes of the past 66 million years has been the rise and global spread of grasses. The great grasslands and savannas that now cover roughly a quarter of Earth's land surface did not exist in the Cretaceous. They developed during the Miocene, roughly 20 to 30 million years ago, driven by a cooling, drying climate, and crucially by the coevolution of grasses with the large mammalian grazers that consumed them. This coevolution was deeply transformative. Grazing mammals shaped the grasslands as much as the grasslands shaped the grazers. Hooves churned the soil. Dung fertilized it. Heavy grazing suppressed trees and shrubs, keeping vast areas open. Grasses, in response, evolved their growth point at the base of the blade rather than the tip, so they could be cropped repeatedly without dying. They evolved silica-reinforced blades and extensive underground root systems. Over millions of years, grazers and grasses made each other. In a dinosaur-dominated world, this particular coevolution would not have occurred. The large herbivores would have been dinosaurian. Different bodies, different digestive systems, different patterns of movement across the landscape. Where the grasses would have spread as broadly under the influence of dinosaurian grazers, and whether they would have evolved the same specific adaptations, is genuinely uncertain. The climatic drivers of grassland expansion, would have operated regardless. As the world cooled through the Miocene equivalent, open and grass-dominated or fern-dominated environments would have spread across the drier continental interiors. But the specific character of those open environments, shaped by 66 million years of co-evolution with dinosaurian herbivores rather than mammalian ones, would have been quite different from the grasslands we know. The forests, too, would have diverged significantly. In our world, temperate forests are rich in large seeded trees, oaks, beeches, chestnuts, whose seeds are dispersed by scatter-hoarding mammals, particularly rodents. Tropical forests have been shaped by fruit-eating mammals and birds. The flowering plants of our world carry in their fruits, their seeds, and their flowers the marks of their long co-evolution with mammalian partners. In the alternate world, those partnerships would have been formed with dinosaurian animals instead, and the flora would reflect it. Different fruit sizes, different seed defenses, different flower structures shaped by different pollinators and dispersers across millions of generations. The vegetation of the alternate world would be recognizable in its broad structure. Tropical forests, temperate woodlands, open plains, boreal conifers, because these formations are driven primarily by climate and geography. But walk into any of them, and the specific plants, the specific ecological relationships, the specific textures of the landscape would be alien. On the land, the most dramatic difference from our own world would be in the large animals. The open tropical and subtropical environments of the alternate world would be dominated by the evolved descendants of the hadrosaurs, large, socially complex herbivores with efficient dental systems, elaborate cranial display structures, and rich vocal communication developed over 66 million years of elaboration. Moving in herds across broad lowland plains, their deep resonant calls carrying across open country, they would fill the ecological role occupied in our world by wildebeest, zebra, and buffalo. But they would be deeply recognizably different animals, shaped by a completely separate evolutionary heritage. The predators watching those herds would be the evolved descendants of the great theropods, not Tyrannosaurus rex itself. That specific animal was already a highly specialized product of its particular evolutionary moment, and 66 million more years would have shaped its lineage into something different, refined further or diversified into new ecological roles. But the fundamental theropod body plan, bipedal, powerful, with large skull, binocular vision, and extraordinary sensory capability, would likely have persisted because it had proven itself across hundreds of millions of years of successful predation. The arms races between these evolved theropod predators, and their prey would have produced, over geological time, remarkable levels of behavioral sophistication on both sides. Prey animals selected for better alarm systems, more coordinated group defense, faster running speeds, and predators selected for better strategic intelligence, better sensory acuity, possibly cooperative hunting in open country. The same ratchet of co-evolutionary competition that has driven the sophistication of predators and prey in our world would have operated here, but between dinosaurian lineages rather than mammalian ones. The oceans of the alternate world would present, in some ways, a more recognizable picture. The fundamental structure of ocean ecosystems, The food chains, from phytoplankton to zooplankton, to fish to large predators, is driven by physics and chemistry more than by the identity of the specific animals at the top. The same current systems, the same upwelling zones, the same patterns of productivity would have characterized the alternate world's oceans. But the large marine predators would have been the descendants of the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, rather than the whales and sharks of our world. The mosasaurs, already formidable apex predators in the Cretaceous, would have had 66 million years to diversify further. Some lineages possibly trending toward greater size, others toward greater agility and specialization. Whether any would have evolved toward filter feeding, filling the ecological role of modern baleen whales, is uncertain. The evolution of filter feeding requires very specific anatomical modifications, and whether the mosasaur lineage would have found that particular evolutionary path is impossible to say with confidence. But the ecological opportunity existed. The open ocean contains vast quantities of small prey concentrated in dense patches, and where ecological opportunity exists, evolution has a tendency to eventually produce an animal that exploits it. The coral reefs of the alternate world would have been among its most spectacular features. Reef ecosystems are extraordinarily persistent. They have survived every mass extinction in Earth's history, rebuilding from surviving lineages each time. Without the end Cretaceous disruption, the alternate world's reefs would have had 66 million additional years of continuous development, producing communities of even greater ecological complexity and coevolutionary depth than our own reefs, themselves already among the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The small mammals of the alternate world would be present in all of its environments, as they had been present in all of the Cretaceous environments that preceded them. Still small, still constrained by the ecological dominance of the dinosaurs in the warm, productive environments where the competitive pressure was greatest, but not entirely without opportunity. In the cooler high latitudes, the boreal forests and subarctic zones where the dinosaurian large fauna would have been thinnest, pressed back by the cold that their evolutionary heritage made difficult to fully overcome. The mammals might have found somewhat more ecological breathing room. Their warm-bloodedness, their insulating fur, their ability to remain active in cold conditions that slowed the larger dinosaurian animals. These traits would have been genuine advantages at high latitudes. Some mammalian lineages in these cooler zones might have grown somewhat larger than their low-latitude counterparts, occupying the roles of small to medium-sized herbivores in environments where the dinosaurian competition was limited. Not the great mammals of our own world's Cenozoic, not elephants or horses or bears, but perhaps animals reaching the size of a modern groundhog or beaver, ecologically significant in their particular cold latitude niche, cognitively refined by 66 million years of continued brain development, even within the constraints of a small body. But in the warm, productive, richly occupied environments of the tropics and temperate zones, the story would have remained the same story it had always been. Small, hidden, constrained, surviving in the margins of a world still, after all those millions of years, thoroughly and completely belonging to the dinosaurs. Imagine standing on a hillside at the edge of a broad, open plain in this alternate world, somewhere in what we would call Eastern Africa, on a warm morning with light coming in low from the east. The vegetation spreading to the horizon is a mix of broad-leafed plants and scattered flowering trees, different in its specific details from anything in our world, but recognizable in its ecological structure. Open ground cover, patches of denser growth along watercourses, the dark line of a distant forest marking the edge of a river valley. Across the plain, a large herd of dinosaurian herbivores moves in its slow and flowing rhythm, their elaborate head crests catching the early light, their deep calls layering over one another in a complex acoustic landscape that speaks to 66 million years of social elaboration. Above them, birds, the alternate world's bird fauna, shaped by coexistence with non-avian dinosaurs across 200 million years, thread through the warm air in flocks whose calls add higher frequencies to the bass notes of the herd below. At the edge of the tree line, something large and bipedal waits in the shadows, patient, watching, its sensory systems tuned by evolutionary refinement to a precision that the Cretaceous tyrannosaurs could only approximate. And somewhere in the root tangle of a fallen tree at the plain's edge, barely visible, a small, warm-blooded creature moves through its own miniature world, furred and bright-eyed, its brain sharper than any Cretaceous mammals, its social bonds more complex, its behavioral repertoire richer, but still small, still constrained, still living in the margins of a world that was built by and for something else entirely. It is a complete world, ancient and internally coherent, shaped by processes running back hundreds of millions of years into deep time. A world of extraordinary richness, following its own logic, playing out its own drama. A world in which, for the foreseeable future, everything that walks its plains and swims its oceans and flies its skies does so without ever wondering about any of it. Could 66 million years of uninterrupted dinosaurian evolution have eventually produced a mind? Could the long, unbroken river of dinosaurian life have arrived, somewhere along its course, at an animal capable of genuine, self-aware intelligence? An animal that could look up at the night sky and wonder what the stars are. That could build tools, pass knowledge across generations, ask questions about its own existence. It is a question that science can approach carefully, with real evidence and real analytical tools. It cannot be answered with certainty. The timescales are too vast, the contingencies too numerous. But it can be explored with intellectual honesty. And the exploration turns out to be genuinely illuminating. Not only about the dinosaurs, but about the nature of intelligence itself. The story of potential dinosaurian intelligence begins with one particular group. Among the many dinosaurian lineages of the late Cretaceous, one stands out immediately when cognitive potential is the question: the troodontids. These were small to medium-sized theropods, lightly built, fast-moving, found across North America and Asia throughout the Cretaceous. Troodon formosus, the best-known member of the group, was roughly 2 meters in length and stood about 1 meter tall at the hip. What makes the troodontids remarkable is their encephalization. Of all known non-avian dinosaurs, The troodontids had the largest brains relative to their body size. Their encephalization quotients, the ratio of actual brain size to the brain size predicted for an animal of their body weight, overlapped with those of some modern birds, placing them well above the reptilian baseline and into territory more commonly associated with cognitively capable animals. But it was not only brain size that distinguished them. The troodontids had large, forward-facing eyes, giving them excellent binocular vision and precise depth perception. Their forelimbs were long and mobile, with grasping hands capable of fine motor control. They were, almost certainly, feathered, and the trend in their lineage across the Cretaceous was toward greater encephalization. Later troodontids had proportionally larger brains than earlier ones. Natural selection was already moving in the direction of greater cognitive capability. In the 1980s, the Canadian paleontologist Dale Russell took these observations seriously and asked what they might eventually lead to. If the troodontid lineage had continued for another 66 million years, following the same encephalization trend that was already underway, what might the result look like? His thought experiment produced what he called the Dinosauroid, a hypothetical evolved troodontid with a greatly enlarged brain, upright bipedal posture, and dexterous forelimbs capable of fine manipulation. Russell's Dinosauroid has been widely discussed and criticized since its introduction. Many paleontologists find it too humanoid, too reflective of an implicit assumption that intelligence inevitably converges on the human body plan. A more realistic, evolved, intelligent troodontid, the critics argue, would have retained much more of its theropod heritage. It would have looked less like a scaled, featherless humanoid and more like a large and highly modified bird, bipedal, feathered, with a proportionally enlarged skull, large forward-facing eyes, and capable forelimbs. Not human-shaped, but shaped by the same functional requirements that the human lineage faced. A large brain needing to be balanced on an upright body, forelimbs freed from locomotion for manipulation, sensory systems refined for complex environmental interaction. The specific form is less important than the underlying question. Was the trajectory real? Was natural selection genuinely moving the troodontid lineage toward greater cognitive capability? The evidence suggests that it was. And when a trend is already underway in a lineage, and the conditions driving that trend persist, evolutionary biology gives us reason to expect the trend to continue. But the case for dinosaurian intelligence faces serious challenges, and they deserve honest attention. The most fundamental is neurological architecture. The mammalian brain is not simply a larger version of a reptilian brain. It possesses a neocortex, a 6-layered outer structure unique to mammals, the seat of virtually all higher cognitive function in our own lineage. The neocortex's layered modular architecture allows it to scale in size while maintaining functional connectivity, which is why the brains of highly intelligent mammals can become so large without losing coherence. Dinosaurs do not have a neocortex. Their brains are organized differently. This does not make high intelligence impossible. The birds demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that remarkable cognitive feats can be achieved through non-mammalian brain architecture. Corvids and parrots solve novel problems, use tools, plan for the future, and demonstrate something that looks remarkably like causal reasoning. They do all of this through a brain structure called the pallium, organized very differently from the mammalian neocortex, but achieving some of the same functional outcomes through different anatomical means. This is actually encouraging for the dinosaurian case. The birds are living proof that the theropod dinosaurian brain architecture is capable of significant cognitive elaboration. The most intelligent birds have already substantially reorganized their brain structure compared to the ancestral avian condition, with certain regions greatly expanded in ways that support more complex cognition. The flexibility is there. The question is whether, given 66 million years of strong selective pressure, the non-avian theropod lineage could have pushed that flexibility far enough. The selective pressure is the crucial variable. Intelligence does not evolve simply because more intelligence is always better. It evolves when specific ecological and social conditions make cognitive capability genuinely advantageous enough to outweigh its costs. And intelligence is costly. Large brains require enormous amounts of energy. They demand long developmental periods, and they require sustained parental investment in offspring. These costs are only worth paying when the cognitive benefits are substantial. The most powerful driver of high intelligence in the lineages where it has most fully developed is not environmental complexity per se, but social complexity. The social intelligence hypothesis, one of the most influential ideas in cognitive evolutionary science, proposes that living in large, complex social groups creates cognitive demands that are qualitatively different from and more demanding than navigating a physical environment alone. A social animal must track relationships between many individuals simultaneously. It must anticipate the behavior of others, model their mental states, understand their intentions. It must navigate complex systems of alliance and competition, remember past interactions across long time periods, and make nuanced strategic decisions about how to behave in situations where the optimal response depends on what others are likely to do. These are precisely the challenges that tend to drive the evolution of general intelligence, the kind of flexible, transferable cognitive capability that, once evolved for social navigation, can be applied across a wide range of other problems. The hadrosaurs were already demonstrating complex sociality in the Cretaceous. Large herds, elaborate vocal communication, extended parental care evidenced in nesting sites with juveniles at various stages of development. The theropods showed evidence of coordinated behavior in some lineages. Given 66 million more years of social elaboration, with the cognitive demands of complex social living ratcheting upward generation by generation, it is plausible, not certain, but genuinely plausible, that some dinosaurian lineage would have developed the kind of rich social cognitive world that, in our own history, was the foundation from which higher intelligence eventually grew. Let us follow this thread forward and try to imagine, as carefully and as grounded in real science as we can manage, what an intelligent dinosaurian animal might actually have been like. It would have been bipedal. The bipedal body plan of the theropod lineage is too deeply established and too mechanically effective to have been easily abandoned. And it has the crucial advantage of freeing the forelimbs for non-locomotor functions. It would have had a large head housing an enlarged brain, though the shape of that skull would have reflected its theropod heritage rather than converging on human proportions. Its forelimbs would have been long and dexterous, capable of fine manipulation, an elaboration of capabilities already present in the troodontids. Its eyes would have been large and forward-facing, providing the precise binocular vision that underlies careful observational learning and tool use. And it would have been feathered, with plumage that likely served communicative as well as insulative functions. A rich visual signaling system built on 66 million years of elaboration. Its vocalizations would have been complex. The theropod lineage was already producing sophisticated acoustic communication in the Cretaceous, and the birds, their living descendants, demonstrate the extraordinary vocal capability that this lineage can achieve. An intelligent theropod descendant, living in a complex social world with strong selective pressure for effective communication, might have developed vocalizations of remarkable richness and specificity. Not language in the human sense, but a structured acoustic system capable of conveying nuanced social and environmental information across long distances. And its social world would have been the foundation of everything else. Extended bonds between individuals. Long periods of parental care, during which young animals absorbed accumulated knowledge and behavioral strategies from their elders. The beginnings of cultural transmission. Knowledge passing between individuals within a generation, and then across generations through social learning, rather than waiting for the slow process of genetic change. Once cultural transmission is established, the pace of adaptive behavioral change accelerates dramatically. A species that can spread a new behavioral innovation through its entire social group within a single generation is playing an entirely different evolutionary game from one that must wait for genetic change to accumulate. Whether this trajectory would have led to something recognizable as civilization, to technology, to external information storage, to the systematic modification of the environment through coordinated collective effort, is the most speculative part of the entire question. A civilization requires several things: a communication system capable of encoding complex information, and some means of storing that information outside of individual memory, the ability to modify the physical environment in sustained, planned ways, and social structures stable and complex enough to coordinate large numbers of individuals across long time periods. Each of these requirements could, in principle, be approached by a cognitively sophisticated dinosaurian lineage, given sufficient time. Dexterous forelimbs capable of tool manufacture, rich vocal communication capable of encoding complex meaning, extended social bonds and long lifespans, allowing the accumulation and transmission of knowledge. These are not impossibilities for a dinosaurian animal. They are extensions of capabilities that were already, in some form, present in the most cognitively advanced dinosaurian lineages of the Cretaceous. What such a civilization would have looked like in its specific details, what it would have built, what it would have valued, how it would have organized itself, is genuinely beyond the reach of confident prediction. It would not have looked like human civilization. it would have reflected a completely different evolutionary heritage, a different sensory world, a different social architecture, a different relationship with the physical environment. But it might, in its broad functional outlines, have shared some of the same features that seem to emerge wherever high intelligence develops. The modification of the immediate environment, the accumulation of information across generations, the development of increasingly sophisticated communication. The deeper question beneath all of this is whether intelligence is, in some meaningful sense, inevitable, whether it is something that life on Earth would tend to produce given sufficient time and the right conditions, regardless of which specific lineage serves as its vehicle. The repeated independent evolution of high cognitive capability in primates, cetaceans, elephants, and corvids suggests that intelligence is a broadly accessible evolutionary strategy, that the ecological conditions which favor it are not extraordinarily rare, and that multiple different lineages can approach it through different neurological pathways. This view offers genuine reason to think that a dinosaurian lineage, given 66 million additional years and the right conditions, had a real chance of eventually arriving at significant cognitive capability. But the specific form that intelligence takes, the level of complexity it reaches, and the timescale over which it develops depend heavily on the starting conditions, the available neurological raw material, and the particular ecological pressures at work. The troodontid lineage was a promising starting point, already encephalized, already showing the trend in the right direction, already possessing physical preconditions for tool use and complex social interaction. But promising is not the same as guaranteed. What we can say, honestly and carefully, is this: the preconditions were real. The trend was real. The ecological conditions that drive cognitive evolution were present. Whether they were sufficient, whether the particular path from theropod brain to reflective intelligence was accessible through the mechanisms of evolutionary change across 66 million years, remains the central, unresolvable question at the heart of this entire exploration. It is a question that is, in its own quiet way, a mirror held up to ourselves. Because to ask whether intelligence was possible in the dinosaurs is ultimately to ask what intelligence really is. Whether it is a rare accident of one particular evolutionary history, or whether it is something that the universe tends to produce, given the right conditions and sufficient time. A question worth sitting with, in the stillness of a world that might never have asked it. Across every continent, every coastline, every mountain range and river valley and open plain, the Earth as it might exist today, if the 66 million years since the Cretaceous had unfolded without the asteroid, without the extinction, without the rise of the mammals, without the primates, without the long, improbable story that eventually produced the human mind. What would that Earth look like? From space, the first thing immediately apparent is what is absent. At night, our actual Earth is luminous. The cities of the world, the coastal megacities, the dense urban corridors of Europe and East Asia and North America create a pattern of light visible from orbit that traces our coastlines, our river valleys, our great plains. The light of human civilization, seen from above, is one of the most distinctive features of our planet. In the alternate Earth, this light does not exist. From orbit, in darkness, the planet presents an unbroken darkness on its land surfaces, broken only by the occasional flicker of wildfire and the faint bioluminescent glow of coastal seas. The continents, after 66 million years of continued tectonic movement, would be in roughly their modern positions, recognizable in broad outline, though their coastlines would differ in detail, shaped by sea levels not identical to our own. By day, the view from space would be dominated by blue ocean, white cloud systems, and land covered in an uninterrupted organic green. Vegetation following the contours of climate and geography, with the logic of a world shaped only by natural processes. No geometric agricultural fields. No straight-edged deforestation. No urban heat signatures. And just the ancient, unbroken complexity of a planet covered in life. Coming down to the surface, the alternate Earth reveals its specific character. The tropical regions would be covered in something broadly analogous to our tropical rainforests. Dense, multi-layered, species-rich canopies of flowering trees above complex understories. The same families of plants would be recognizable, since the angiosperm radiation had already occurred by the Cretaceous. But the specific species, the specific fruits and flowers and ecological relationships, would have been shaped by 66 million years of coevolution with dinosaurian animals rather than mammalian ones. The fruits of the alternate world's trees would have been designed by evolution for dinosaurian seed dispersers. Different sizes, different colors, different nutritional profiles, reflecting the visual systems and dietary preferences and digestive chemistries of animals very different from the mammals that shaped our own world's flora. The flowers would reflect different pollinator partnerships. Walk through these alternate tropical forests, and the broad structure would be familiar. The layered canopy, the dim forest floor, the lianas threading through the mid-story. But the specific textures, colors, and ecological relationships would be those of a world that never knew a primate. Moving outward from the equatorial belt into the tropical and subtropical open environments, the vegetation opens up into something analogous to our savannas. Broad plains of mixed ferns and flowering shrubs, scattered trees along watercourses, the whole landscape shaped by millions of years of grazing pressure from dinosaurian herbivores rather than mammalian ones. It is across these open landscapes that the great herds move. The descendants of the hadrosaurs evolved far beyond their Cretaceous ancestors across 66 million years, but still carrying within their body plan the deep heritage of their lineage, would be among the most ecologically dominant large animals on Earth. Their dental batteries, refined by millions of years of further evolution, would process plant material with extraordinary efficiency. Their social structures, elaborated across geological time by the same cognitive arms races that have driven social complexity in our world's large mammals, would be rich and complex in ways that the Cretaceous hadrosaurs could only begin to suggest. Their vocalizations, deep, resonant, modulated by elaborate cranial structures that had continued to diversify and elaborate over millions of years of sexual selection and social communication, would carry across these open landscapes in layered acoustic displays of a richness and complexity that would be unlike anything in our world's soundscape. And watching those herds, from the edges of the woodland or the shadow of a rocky outcrop, the predators, the evolved descendants of the great theropods, not Tyrannosaurus rex itself, but something shaped by 66 million more years of refinement from that starting point, would be among the most capable predatory animals that had ever lived on Earth. Their sensory systems, already extraordinary in the Cretaceous, would have been further refined by the relentless arms race with prey animals that had simultaneously been evolving faster running speeds, better alarm systems, and more sophisticated collective defense behaviors. The alternate world's great theropod descendants and their prey would have driven each other over geological time to levels of behavioral sophistication that the Cretaceous animals could only approximate. The oceans would be dominated by the evolved descendants of the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs in their large predator roles, animals shaped by 66 million years of marine evolution into forms potentially as diverse as the modern cetaceans, ranging from agile open ocean pursuit predators to possibly, in some lineages, filter feeders exploiting the vast productivity of the open sea. The coral reefs of the alternate world, with 66 million additional years of uninterrupted development behind them, would be among its most extraordinary features. Communities of deeper co-evolutionary history and potentially greater ecological complexity than even our own reefs, themselves already the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The high-latitude environments, the boreal forests and subarctic zones, would be where the small mammals had found their greatest ecological expression. In these colder regions, where the dinosaurian large fauna was thinnest, and the competitive pressure therefore least intense, some mammalian lineages might have grown somewhat larger than their low-latitude counterparts. Animals perhaps reaching the size of a modern beaver or groundhog, cognitively refined by 66 million years of continued brain evolution, filling roles as small to medium-sized herbivores in ecosystems where the cold had created breathing room that the warmer, more productive regions never offered. But in the tropics, in the temperate zones, in the rich and productive environments where the great herds moved and the theropod descendants hunted, the mammals would still be what they had always been: small, hidden, living in the margins, surviving with the quiet, patient efficiency of animals that had been doing it for hundreds of millions of years. There is no one in this world to build a city, no one to clear a forest or plant a field, no one to dam a river or mine a hillside or burn a fuel extracted from the compressed remains of ancient life. The atmosphere of the alternate Earth would be a natural atmosphere, evolving along its slow geological trajectory, without the rapid, intense perturbation of human industrial activity. Its climate, in this alternate present, would be whatever point in the natural glacial interglacial cycle it had reached. A natural climate, shaped entirely by geology and astronomy, without the human fingerprint that has become so defining a feature of our own planet's recent history. From the perspective of any hypothetical visitor capable of appreciating it, the alternate Earth would be a world of extraordinary beauty. Not the beauty of our world, which is partly the beauty of things humans have made, layered over the beauty of the natural world, but the beauty of a world that has had only itself to work with. The beauty of forests shaped by no hand, but the slow hand of ecology. The beauty of animal forms refined by hundreds of millions of years of natural selection into shapes of functional elegance. The beauty of ecosystems so old and so internally coherent that they feel to imagine them like something complete. But there would be no one there to call it beautiful. Or perhaps almost no one. Because the question left open by the previous chapter remains open here. In the cooler, more variable environments of the middle latitudes, in some social lineage of small to medium-sized theropod descendants living in a cognitively demanding world of complex social relationships and ecological challenges, the seeds of something new might be present. Not yet civilization, not yet language in any human sense, but the beginning of a mind, something looking out at the world with more than instinct and processing its experience with more than reflex, beginning, in some tentative and nascent way, to understand rather than merely respond. Whether those seeds would have grown, given more time, into something recognizable as genuine intelligence, that question we have explored and cannot finally answer. What we can say is that the world itself would be there, ancient and unhurried, turning in its orbit under the same stars that have always shone above it, rich with life, full of sound and movement, and the slow drama of predator and prey, and the turning of seasons, complete in itself, waiting for no one.